Well, thank you, Sally. I've given lots of talks at APS meetings, but I've never before been asked to give one to just talk about myself. But I am really thrilled. I've been looking forward to it and giving a lot of thought to it. It's purely coincidental that I'm giving a pod talk at the same meeting that my book is now on sale in the APS Press, and I'll be signing books this afternoon and again tomorrow. Now that book is somewhat of a memoir. I didn't exactly follow John Niederhauser's style, but somewhat in that direction. And a lot of stories in there that if I had time I'd tell here as well. But and some of these stories I'm going to tell today are in that book. But it was, I'd say, purely coincidental that these two events happened at the same time. So I grew up on a 400-acre family farm in northwestern Minnesota. I'm the oldest of 8 siblings, and you better believe that I learned early. I was forced into part of the farm workforce pretty early in my life, even about 5 or 6 years old. But I loved it, and I was like my dad's shadow, whether we were building fence, making hay, threshing barley, digging and picking potatoes. I was out there, and as I say, I really loved it. In fact, my dad used to brag that a man and a boy can do the same work of 2 men, and I was the boy. So my first 8 years was in a one-room country school, and at one time, out of say 16 or 17 kids in that school, 4 or 5 of them were my brothers and sisters and myself. We were pretty close together as we were born, and so we kind of step by step through that school. That school is now parked in a place with some other old buildings as a historic site. So I kind of think, well, gee, now maybe I was a pioneer because my old school is now put in a pioneer village, but not really. One of the things that I like to think about was that, or look back on, was I did help my dad farm with horses. And I did watch the conversion of American agriculture from horses to tractors. And now here I am in 1980, still attending APS meetings as a plant pathologist. So that's quite a bridge of time span and change. But I was going to be a farmer. There was no doubt about it. But one difference in my attitude versus my cousins and uncles and so forth is they went directly into farming from 8th grade or maybe 2 years of high school. And I decided that I needed a university education. And North Dakota Agricultural College, now NDSU, was just 13 miles from our farm. So I commuted, took classes, and was back on the farm to help do the farming, milking the cows and so forth. And that went on until my sophomore year. And by then my brothers were able to pretty well handle the farm. Meanwhile, I got a part-time job working for an ARS plant pathologist, Roland Timian, working on barley stripe mosaic virus. And I still have the paperwork to show that my rate of pay was 85 cents an hour. Anyway, that's when I really began to get interested in science. But meanwhile, I was definitely still on the bend of being a farmer. But I decided that I needed a double major. So I majored first in animal husbandry, did livestock judging all over the Midwest, and then I went into agronomy. And that's where I really found my niche. So something did cause me to change my career path. And I'm headed to be a farmer, but I love science, and I got to thinking about a career in plant pathology, and I thought, no, I don't know about that, or even in science. So what caused me to change my career path? When my fiancée told me that she didn't intend to live on a farm. As of this month, we'll have been married 59 years. Put up your hand, Bev. So in the fall of 1958, newly married, I went into graduate school at North Dakota. By then, the name had changed to North Dakota State University. I was majoring in agronomy because there was no plant pathology department there at the time. And Dick Kiesling was brought in from Michigan State to form a department that would grant graduate degrees at the master's level only. And so I'm the first graduate student to get a degree in a graduate degree at North Dakota State University. And I tell NDSU students, you go to the library and look way at the beginning of the thesis, and there's mine. My first APS meeting was 1960, Green Lake, Wisconsin. How many in this room attended that meeting? I knew Charlie would have been there. It was a Baptist camp, and we were actually in buildings with bunked in rooms, 2 bunks high, with a community bathroom in each building, one. No air conditioning in Wisconsin in August. It was awful. And that reputation lingered on for a long, long time. And it's interesting that there's only one person here besides me that attended that meeting. It was dry, of course, but there was a watering hole about a half a mile down the road, and that's where everybody gathered every night. The only problem was getting back in to the camp. At 10 o'clock, they locked the gate with a log chain and a big, heavy padlock. And we had to climb over the fence, which was no problem for me, but I think some probably had a little difficulty, but that was quite a meeting. It was also my second wedding anniversary when I was there, and that didn't make me very popular. Fast forward 24 years to 1984 in Guelph, Ontario, Canada, the last campus meeting of an APS. And I was the president. And I talked Bev into coming with me. She said, I don't like campus meetings. I said, yeah, but I'm the president. We're going to have the presidential suite. It'll probably be in the local hotel or maybe in the student union. When we got there, I found out that the presidential suite was the caretaker's room in the basement of one of the dorms. And by the way, as in 1960, no air conditioning in the Midwest in August. A lot of complaints, but we were downstairs, single beds, concrete walls, no TV, no telephone. It turns out, I don't want to say fortunately, because it wasn't good, but Bev had foot surgery and was in a foot brace. And I said to the local arrangements, I said, we can't get up and down those steps. She can't. Ray Tarleton was horrified. He had totally trusted that Canada, it was joint with Canada, of course, that there would be a room for me, a suite for us. And he worked some magic and put us into a local 1950s version motel, and it was very nice. There's more story to it than that, but that's all I really need to go into. Now, back to 1960 at Green Lake. I was on the hunt for a place to do a graduate degree and do a PhD. So I was talking to different members, different faculty, department chairs, and so forth from different universities, and pretty excited about it all. It wasn't long after Sputnik, of course, so the U.S. was shocked, and science was opening, or the U.S. government was opening up the flood of gates for science and funding. So it was a pretty good time to be going into graduate school. One person I did not talk to was the president of APS at that time, William C. Snyder from UC Berkeley. And little did I know that I would end up doing my PhD with him. I'd applied to Berkeley and hadn't heard anything. And then there came an email, or I mean, not an email, not in those days. It said, a cable said, have assistantship for you at $2,900, that's per year, starting February 1961. So in 1961, Bev and I, with then our daughter Lori, who's here, at age 1, pulled all of our contents in a U-Haul trailer from Fargo, North Dakota to Berkeley, and I entered graduate school. Bill Snyder had 4 or 5 graduate students at the time, plus he was chairman of the department. They were all working on Fusarium root rot of bean, and that's what I ended up doing my thesis on. And that set me on the course that I have been on ever since of specializing in root diseases and soil-borne pathogens. Actually, because of how busy he was, I had very little one-on-one time with him. And I do think that probably the only time he really knew what I had done was when I had finished my thesis and he read it. But I don't want to take anything away from him because I learned so much about him on being the complete plant pathologist. And what I really remember was the field trips to the Salinas Valley of California. And he teaching us how to make a diagnosis and put all the pieces together, and how he used to say, you have to know the whole fungus and not just this little part of it. You've got to keep in mind the whole thing. Another thing that I learned from him, and I'll never forget it, and I passed it on to my students, and I'll quote exactly, when doing basic research, think applied, and when doing applied research, think basic. Isn't that neat? Now, there was another person in the department, Milt Schroet. Milt had just finished his PhD under Bill Snyder on Fusarium root rot of bean, and was now hired as the phytobacteriologist. And Milt invited me to do my thesis in his lab. He gave me a corner and a place for my microscope and to do my work. And he was my mentor in terms of my thesis research. And we weren't that different in ages, but still he had a lot of experience. And we remain good friends and in contact to this day. Many of you will remember Sam Smith, who was chairman of plant pathology and dean of the College of Agriculture at Penn State University, and then in 1985 moved to Pullman and became president of Washington State University. Sam was a graduate student at Berkeley the same time I was, majoring in plant pathology, and we lived nearby in student housing with our growing families, and we used to commute together up to the campus and back that night, and then go back up later on at the night when the kids were asleep and work another couple of hours. Those were the tough days, you know, when we really had to put in lots of hours. Well, one thing Sam and I used to do was take our brown bag lunch over to Giannini Hall down in the basement where Ken Baker had an office. And Ken used to lead discussions that were just terrific. There'd be 2 or 3 others in the group as well. And from there, I mean, it was so interesting. He had so much experience to share. And out of that, when Sam and I were both thinking, we finished about the same time, we were thinking about getting a job. We each had 2 kids in our family by then. And Ken said, why don't you apply for a postdoc to work overseas? And that was a totally different idea for us, but we did, to NSF. Now, NSF also handled the NATO postdoctoral applications, and Sam and I each won one of the 40 NATO postdoctoral fellowships awarded that year, of which 9 were in the biological sciences. And when Ken Baker introduced us to the seminar of the faculty, he introduced Sam and me as the NATO twins. And I'll never forget that. One of the individuals there was Noel Flenchy. He was from Australia, chairman of the Department of Plant Pathology at the Waite Agriculture Research Institute in Adelaide. And I got to know him pretty well, and he actually invited me. He said, I can probably support you if you want to come to Australia on a postdoc. Well, then I got my own NATO, and that was to go to Australia to work with Noel Flenchy. And one of the things that I learned from Noel Flenchy was you have to be able to sell your research. You can't just publish it and let it just kind of go out there. You've got to find out what is the market, what is the audience that needs to know about your research. And quite frankly, of all the reasons that I have written in my book as to why I wrote that book, I'm still selling my research, even research that I did 40 years ago, that I'm as proud of today as I was having done it there. And there's still an audience for that research. After I finished my NATO postdoc, Baker alerted me to the job at Pullman with ARS to work on root diseases of wheat. It was a brand new job funded by Congress at the request of ARS, the leadership, to put a position somewhere in the United States to work on root diseases of wheat. And it's to this day the only ARS program to work on root diseases of wheat. And they decided to put it at Pullman in what was known as the Regional Cereal Disease Research Laboratory, formerly the SMUT Research Laboratory, headed up by C.S. Holton. And that's where I landed. Was hired without an interview, only a civil service exam, and hired at a GS-12, which was pretty significant at that time, thanks to that one-year postdoc, or I'd have been a GS-11. That made a big difference over the rest of my career. 4 years later, at the Spokane meeting of APS, Ken Baker invited me up to his room. And he invited me to join him in authoring a book on biological control. That was in 1969. my 4th year on the job, and I thought, wow, I just don't know whether I can do this or not. One of the things I learned about dealing with root diseases of wheat in the Northwest was that crop rotation was not really an option. It's going to be wheat, maybe wheat 2 years out of 3, wheat 3 years out of 3, at least 2 years or 1 year out of 2. Tillage was going out because of soil erosion and the cost. There's no host plant resistance, and there's no chemical sort of soil fumigation. So my job was to control the root diseases of wheat without crop rotation, without tillage, without chemical control, and without host plant resistance. So I thought, well, maybe biological control is the way to go. And the book that I just wrote is, in fact, a summary of what I accomplished with a lot of help from colleagues that I would have to say falls under the broad definition that Ken Baker and I put forth in our first book of biological control. Early on in my job, Stu Holton, in fact, it was the second week, and by then I had 3 children, and one of them is here in addition to Lori. Julie's around here somewhere, back there. And he said, we're going to take a trip. And we, with one other member of the lab, we went into Idaho first, just over the state line from Washington, then down into northeast Oregon, and then all the way to the west to Corvallis, to a wheat workers meeting, and then back up through southeast Washington. And all the while we were stopping looking at wheat fields, and he was to show me the root diseases of wheat. But he didn't know what he was looking for, and neither did I. But we saw a lot of wheat, and we saw a lot of diseased wheat, whether it was root disease or something else. So after we got home, he called me into his office the next Monday, and he said, you've seen them, meaning the root diseases of wheat. He said, your job is to control them. You can study them all you want, but your job is to control them. Now, he had studied smuts all his career, but he also controlled common bunt of wheat with a fungicide, hexachlorobenzene. And he got a lot of recognition for that. So he figured the same thing can be done for root diseases. Study it and then control it, and you're good. And then he said something else to me. He said, I haven't the slightest idea what you should do. But you got a PhD at Berkeley, you ought to know what to do. Do you know what that did to me? It was fabulous. That was my job description. I was in charge. And one thing I learned as a federal employee, and I think it applies generally, whoever has to tell you what you're supposed to do, it will be if anybody has to tell you what you're supposed to do, that will be a lower pay grade. So if you are the only one that knows what to do, that'll get you a higher pay grade over time. And believe me, it worked. Anyway, I just was so, it was just like suddenly the ball was in my hands, and I thought, I'm in charge. And that couldn't have been better for me. And I did that too to a few people that I hired in one way or another. I remember Bill Zaumeyer from ARS used to say, I give my guys enough rope to climb up or to hang themselves. And that's just what Stu Holton did for me. Sometime during my second or third year on the job at Pullman, Holton also called me into his office, and he said, you're going to be on a new committee of APS. You and some other early career plant pathologists, members of APS. And he said, the committee is being called the New Projects Committee, and it's also being nicknamed the Blue Ribbon Committee. And your job is to come up with ideas, new ideas that will strengthen the society, maybe fresh ideas because you're fresh, and maybe ideas that those that have been in the leadership roles for a long time haven't quite thought about. So before the days of fax and before the days of email, longhand correspondence plus annual meetings, we began to exchange ideas over a 2 or 3 year period. And 2 things settled out. This was now in the late 60s, early 70s. That APS, 1, needed to have a second journal for applied plant pathology, and 2, APS needed to have a presence in Washington, D.C. So that resonated maybe just so-so, but it wasn't much more than 10 years later that APS takes over Plant Disease Reporter and turns it into Plant Disease. That the first issue is dated January 1980, but it was published in July 1979, so we had 6 months to market it. And I chaired that committee. It was a great committee to work on, and I just got an email from Steve Nelson, who said that he's working on it with Paul Peterson on summarizing the conversion of Plant Disease Reporter to Plant Disease. Also, but about 1993 or 94, George Agrios appointed the first National Plant Pathology Board, which has become the Public Policy Board, with a very strong president in Washington, D.C. Amazing what this Public Policy Board's done, and I'm looking at Jackie and some others around here that have made that happen. On that first National Plant Pathology Board, Sue Tolan was on it, and Ann Vitteber, Louise Sequeira, Arthur Kelman, and myself. And Cliff Gabriel, who was a staffer with the National Academy of Sciences, one of the sections, was kind of our liaison go-to guy in Washington, D.C. Now that reminds me of Arthur Kelman, one of my other mentors. What a terrific guy. And I miss him so. Bev and I, with he and Helen, used to spend a lot of time together in Washington, D.C. at annual meetings of the Academy and so forth. Arthur, many ways affected my career. One of the ways, he called me in about 1985 and said, Jim, I'm chairman of the nominations committee for the next president of the International Society for Plant Pathology, and I'd like to put your name on the ballot. Alan Kerr had chaired the Congress when it was in Melbourne and was supposed to have bumped up to be president, and he said he didn't want to do it. So for I think the first time, ISPP actually had an election. And I said, well, Arthur, who else is on the ballot? And he said, nobody, just you. And that was a railroad job if ever there was one. Also, about 5 years, not quite 5 years later, but he was chief scientist of the USDA's competitive grants program, known as the NRI. And he called me and he said, Jim, I'm finishing my term as the chief scientist, and he said, I'd like to recommend you to be my successor, starting in October 1993. And again, I was the only name being put forward, and I said, okay, I'll do that. So commuted from Pullman to Washington, D.C. for 2.5 years, Bev with me about half the time, and it was a great experience. It's changed so much since then, including you don't just appoint your successor anymore. There's a lot more red tape to it. Well, I've had so many wonderful people to work with, but I want to narrow down to 2 people that really deserve special attention. Oh wait, one thing I want to go back. When Holton said, your job is to control them, you can study them all you want, but your job is to control them and you ought to know what to do. It just happened that there was an outbreak of Fusarium root and crown rot caused by Fusarium calmorum in the lower rainfall area of eastern Washington. And Bill Briel, one of my other mentors, took me to that field in September after I started my job in July. And that field had been devastated by that disease that had not hardly been seen at all for years anywhere else. What caused it to be so devastating in that one field? Well, it was at first seeding of the new dwarf wheat. And the idea was that maybe there's something weak about the dwarf wheats that causes them to be extra susceptible to Fusarium calmorum. And I worked on that disease. First of all, did I know what to do? I'd worked on Fusarium for both my PhD and my postdoc, and I did know what to do. My tools were a single spore needle and how to isolate a single clematispore from soil and dilution plate count and estimate the populations. Completely different set of tools from what young faculty start out with today, but it's just what I needed to establish that that field had 3,000 clematispores of Fusarium calmorum per gram in the top 4 inches. How did it get there? Worked all of that out, and Bob Papendick, a soil physicist who was a very great collaborator, he and I worked out that it was due to the plants developing super low plant water potentials due to over-fertilizing with nitrogen. And at the first International Congress of Plant Pathology in London in 1968, I introduced the concept of water potential measured as energy status in pascals or bars to the field of plant pathology. And we applied those tools and understood why that disease was so devastating in those dwarf wheats. As I used to tell the farmers, you're fertilizing for 100 bushel wheat and you got water for 60 bushel wheat. And that is, in fact, it's going to be a wreck. Now, I was just coming to talk about a couple of colleagues. One of them is Dave Weller. Dave Weller was on my postdoc, the first USDA grant program in 1978, and I got a grant for 3 years to study take-all decline, and I hired Dave Weller as my postdoc out of Michigan State. And he's the one that began to open up, although there was already information about the pseudomonads, but he began to open up the field and was so successful that ARS put money in my program to hire Dave full-time and to make our unit the Root Disease and Biological Control Research Unit. A little bit after that, I hired Linda Tomashaw, and we became a team. Linda was the molecular biologist, biochemist, Dave was the rhizosphere microbiologist, and I was the agronomist field, back to my training, which is why I'm so inclined towards testing my hypotheses in the field and provide the base for the more basic work. And what an association that's been. And they're still working there while I'm now retired. Tim Paulus has replaced me, not replaced me, but assumed my position with additional funds from ARS to make sure that it would remain viable. And it's just been a great ride. I couldn't have been happier. I have to say thanks to WSU for giving me an academic home, the chance for graduate students, some of whom are here today. I have to thank ARS for all the great support I had, including allowing my program to grow up to be all that it could be. And the Washington Wheat Commission, now the Washington Grains Commission, that funded my program for the field work for about 30 years, and in 1998 gave WSU a $1.5 million gift to the foundation to establish the R. James Cook Endowed Chair in Wheat Research, which now Scott Holbert is occupying. And the last thing, while I was in that position, I started a new WSU research farm called the WSU Precision Ag Direct Seed Research Farm. And in 2006, after I retired, the Board of Regents named that farm the R.J. Cook Agronomy Farm. So how could I ask for any more than that? It's just been fabulous. And it's been a pleasure to have such a nice audience here today that I could share this with. Thank you very much. Time for a couple of questions. I was supposed to allow more time for that.
Well, we have time. Have questions?
I'm kind of curious about W.C. Schneider. Did he start a lot of his fusarium work in Central America?
Well, he was involved with the United Fruit Company. You're right. And he was a consultant when they were dealing with the fusarium wilt of banana. And they had a new race of the pathogen that was quite devastating on the Gros Michel, or else that's the one that replaced the variety that was going out. I don't quite remember. But I have a lot of his pictures, and Ken Baker was part of that entourage too, and some of the pictures I have of Bill Snyder in South America, or Central America, were dealing with that disease. So absolutely. And Luis Sequeira was also part of that, that effort. And of course, he came out of Costa Rica. Yeah.
Hey, Jim, you have had an accomplished career and model to all of us plant pathology. But if you had to do it all over again, would you do anything different?
Oh. Well, of course, the obvious answer is no. How could I have done any better in terms of satisfaction? That's what it was really all about. Just pure satisfaction. And in my book, field work and working with root diseases, you've got to dig these plants out of the ground. You've got to wash the roots out, and then you've got to spend hours looking at them. Kurt's sitting here. He spent a lot of time doing that. He was my last technician as an ARS employee, and then went on to do his PhD with Tim Paulus. But anyway, it was just backbreaking work and tedious work. But you grind your way through it, and then, as I write in my book, goes all the way from drudgery to exhilaration. And isn't that what many of you have experienced in your research is, I got to do it over. If I had to repeat my experiment, it had to be another year. A lot of times if I had greenhouse experiments, it's just another month. So I had to be able to live with that. But no, I don't see what I could have done different. And I got to live in Pullman and raise my family in a beautiful university village. And now I'm 80 years old and I can't give it up. Yes, so my book actually involved a big family effort, and it's stated right on the inside. APS Press wrote that this book was produced by the Cook family. My oldest son wrote the foreword, and Lori she's a technical editor in her own right with a business, and and Julie in the back worked for Adobe for 15 years and is a graphic artist, graphic design, and designed the book. And Jessica is with her. Where's Jessica? She's 15 years old. And Bev did proofing and so forth and found more stuff. She's a great proofreader. Anyway, and then we have one other son who was the one that said, Dad, untold stories is not enough. You got to say more than that. And then I came up with 40 years of field research on root diseases of wheat, which did spell it out a little better. So I give him some credit too.
And then your niece.
And my niece, quite by surprise, Kalia, where are you? Over there. So we had no expectation of Kalia showing up today. She lives a couple hours from her mother is my youngest sister. And she's one of 24 grandchildren of my parents, and the youngest, and Lori's the oldest. And anyway, we're just delighted to have you here. She was already up here checking out the room and everything. So. And Janaea and okay, her two daughter and son. Delighted to have you here, Clea. Any other questions? My room is air conditioned this year. By the way, that motel room wasn't air conditioned either. Yes, it was the last campus meeting. But I have to say, whatever Ray did, I know he had at least 2 staff bunked together in order to free up a room. But even then, we had to stand in the queue because there were others waiting for the rooms too. But he.
And I said, as the president's wife, Jim, I think we're going to be sleeping on a park bench. We didn't have a room when we didn't stay in a caretaker's basement apartment. So they found us this room, and it worked.
Yeah, and it was within walking distance of all the meeting rooms.
I wasn't that welcoming. I remember it very well.
You do, okay.
Well, I think we'll, okay, one more question and then we'll move on.
Did you ever during your career do about, say, forget about this, especially those days when we were in the basement, say, forget about this, I want to go back and be a farmer?
I want to go back and what?
And to be a farmer.
And be a farmer. No, I did not. But the headlines in the local paper when the Board of Regents named the new farm after me, Jim Cook finally gets his farm. Thank you for mentioning it so I could share that with you.
Well, thank you, Jim. It was really enlightening and fun, and we really appreciate you taking the time. And
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
on your book too, so I'm sure you'll be happy to talk more at your book signing.
Yep.